whatever your preference is. A little bit about myself. The commander of the 89th Airlift Squadron. We fly the C-17s around, maybe fly over your house from time to time here at Wright-Patt Air Force Base. I have been in the Air Force for 21 years, commissioned from the Air Force Academy in 1998, served active duty for about 10 years, and I've been a reservist for the last 11 years. I do this part-time. The reserves are great. They let us transition from full-time to part-time. So for the previous 8 years, until the summer of 2018, when I took this job, I was full-time. Did the last 3 years of that in Hawaii, which was awesome. And returned to my civilian career after 8 years of full-time Air Force, which I'm an airline pilot on the outside. Any questions along that? I'm just going to give you a brief overview. Oh, excuse me. I'm trying to get this. Where's my IT guy?
Yep.
Oh, no.
Is that working?
Oh, next. There we go. Okay, perfect. So overview, what we'll talk about. We'll start off we'll do an overview of the C-17 and what that big gray machine is capable of doing that you see flying over your house, doing touch and goes at Wright-Patt all the time. And kind of why it exists, period, dot. It's the headline of the slide deck. It's to project America's strength and our goodwill globally. We'll get into the technical aspects of the range and how we can basically fly, but we have a global mission right out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We are the reserves, but on any given day, 24/7, 365, we have 2 or 3 missions out somewhere in the globe. So right now we have a crew that's in Africa and another one that's in Europe. We're sending one out the door to hit the Pacific later on this week. So we're everywhere. And when we're not out doing that, we are training and maintaining our proficiency and our currency in the airplane and the ability to execute that mission. We'll take a look, give you some interesting stats on Air Force Reserve Command and our role in the total force, what we call total force integration in the Air Force. And that means you have the active component, active duty, the Air Force Reserve, and the Air National Guard, and kind of how that all comes together. And we project air power across all 3 of those services, not services, but 3 of those entities collectively on behalf of the joint force. And I've been told from senior leaders of sister services that when it comes to total force integration, integrating your reserves into your active component, the Air Force has that shacked better than any other service, and I tend to agree with that. And then as the commander, my job is to advocate for the people and make sure that their career is being progressed correctly. And so part of that is I get to be the cheerleader, and I get to tell their great stories when they do wonderful things, and we do have some exceptional members of our squadron. So I'll briefly touch, and you'll have to bear with me while I brag on them a little bit. But that's the fun part of it. So there's the C-17. You see under the bottom of the picture there, if you're not distracted too much by that beautiful piece of machinery. But the Air Force has 5 core missions. That's air and space superiority, what we call ISR, which stands for Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance, rapid global mobility, which is our piece of the pie in the C-17, and strategic airlift, global strike, and command and control. We have many different tribes in the Air Force. We all come together under the larger umbrella of providing air power for America and for the joint force as needed. So I'll focus on the rapid global mobility and specifically the C-17 for the purpose of what I do on a daily basis. So the C-17 itself, it's designed specifically to deploy, sustain, and redeploy American troops, our interagency partners. That would be, we help FEMA during emergency responses domestically. We can move other agencies in the U.S. federal government, and then also our coalition allies and partners. We'll move them. Some of them don't have the the strategic reach that we have. They don't have the strategic airlift inherent and organic in their Air Force. So we will move them around to as they work with us in coalition operations. The C-17 can also be changed in the back to not fly cargo, but there's stanchions up, and there's doctors, nurses, and med techs that are training to turn the back of the C-17 into essentially a flying ambulance, if you will. They keep you know, everything back there. They coordinate with us on what altitudes we can and cannot fly at, because some of the patients may have restrictions on what altitude they can be at based on their condition. I don't understand all of that because I'm not a medical doctor, but I do know how to keep the airplane at a certain cabin altitude to ensure that the patients are cared for. So that becomes our role in that, but a lot of close coordination in that. Humanitarian relief, I touched on that briefly when I talked about projecting America's goodwill. That's both, we'll drill down on that a little bit later. And then most impressively, if you've seen the C-17 fly around, it's about 170 feet long by 170 feet wide. I don't know if that's on your fact sheet. You've got fact sheets on both the C-17 and the wing 445th Airlift wing. So an airplane that massive can land in 3,500-foot runways. They don't even have to be prepared runways, semi-prepared, so like gravel, what we call a dirt strip, we can land on what you call a dirt strip. So it doesn't actually have to be, you know, a standard normal runway that you'd see at any civilian airport or any Air Force base. That allows us to get into and out of places that other airframes cannot. To put the 3,500 foot in context, I flew previous to the C-17 at the beginning of my career, Learjets, which are little, almost like executive jet. It is an executive jet. It's repurposed for military purposes to fly admirals, generals, and leaders of our government. That little airplane that fit 6 to 8 people needed 5,000 feet of runway to operate. So this massive, giant beast only takes 3,500, which when you see it, and in training environments, we'll have the 3,500 foot runway next to a normal standard runway, which typically it's going to depend on geographically where that airfield is located. The higher you are in elevation, the more runway you need. The hotter the typical ambient temperature, the more runway you need. But typically they're anywhere from 8 to 10,000 feet long. So you see this little postage stamp for the first time when you're up there in training next to, it's in Oklahoma, so it does get hot. It's not really high. I'm estimating that runway at 10, 11,000 feet. I don't know for sure, but it just looks like this like someone's driveway in relative to that long runway. And you think to yourself, I'm going to land this big monster on that, and you do. That's how the airplane's designed. It's an engineering marvel, quite frankly. Another capability we have, we can airdrop. So we open up the back door in flight, and equipment with parachutes rolls out, and/or paratroopers jump out the side door, or the special forces will free fall and just kind of run out the back on the ramp in flight. A little bit more about that, but and that gets into projecting America's strength with joint forcible entry operations, as we call them in the military, and I'll talk about a couple of those. And then certainly sustaining forward operating bases. We saw this in Afghanistan, a lot of smaller elements of Army troops out there, and we would drop them stuff that they needed just in time. Next. So a little bit about the technical specifications. I talked about how massive it is. 585,000 pounds it can take off at. Yeah, that's a lot of weight. So the airplane itself weighs, without any fuel or cargo, about 280,000 pounds. So as you add on fuel to give you range, and then cargo with the max payload being 170,000 pounds. So that's a lot of weight. It's designed to carry 1 Abrams tank, which, depending on the configuration of an Abrams tank, it'll weigh about 120,000 pounds. 3 Stryker vehicles, which are the kind of the Humvees of this generation, if you will. They can fit in there and we can take them. Number of helicopters, depending on the size. We fly the helicopters around too. They take the blades off, otherwise they wouldn't fit in the airplane. And then they pull the helicopters off with the blades, reassemble them right there. Some of the smaller ones I've seen reassembled and flown off before we even took off again, within about 30, 40 minutes of us landing. And I don't know that they were hurrying, so I'm sure if they were hurrying, they could do it a lot quicker than that. And interestingly enough with that, if you look at, not that you would want to, but Army contracting regulations on how they buy, develop and buy new equipment, a caveat in that is it has to be air transportable, because you have to be able to get it where the fight is, and that's never going to be anywhere, you know, on our shores, let's hope. It has to be able to air transportable and fit within the dimensions of the C-17. So as they develop and field, you know, new vehicles and, you know, guns and helicopters and things like that, they all have to fit it back there. We can take it up to 45,000 feet. We don't typically fly that high. We typically fly a little bit lower than that, but that is as high as we can get up. And that is all weight dependent as well. So if we're full up, we're not going to make it up to 45,000 feet. We'd have to be a little bit lighter. An interesting capability of the C-17, we can put our engines into reverse thrust in flight in the air. So when you land on a civilian airliner, you hear the engines kind of spool up and roar up. Well, that's reverse thrust. Any airline you use it for. Stopping in like an aborted takeoff, rejected takeoff, or a landing scenario. I don't know of any other airplane that deploys them in flight. And so in the C-17, it's not truly reverse thrust where it's pushing against your forward momentum. It's upward and aft, so your engines, as opposed to, I'm going to use your gavel as an aid, okay? So if you imagine that this is your engine, so its thrust is going that way to move you across the sky that way. A reverse thrust would do just the opposite and kind of move you backwards, help you stop on a runway on the 737 or something like that. In the C-17, the thrust vector gets moved forward and up, so it pushes you down. During landing, that's effective because it puts the weight of the airplane on the gear, and then the brakes engage, and that's what helps you stop. But in flight, as you're flying along and now your thrust vector's here, if this is your airplane, guess which way it's going to go? Down that way like a rock, because your thrust is no longer pushing you across the sky, it's pushing you down to the ground. It's a pretty amazing capability. I always demo it in the sim when I do sim demonstrations for folks. It's a little unsettling the first time you see it in the real airplane, because the whole airplane starts shaking. Typical, in addition to bringing the throttles to reverse, you'll nose over because you want that steep descent. And so when you first do that, you kind of get almost like a zero gravity kind of scenario where if stuff isn't secured in the cockpit or in the airplane, it basically just comes floating up. So if you leave like a pen on a console, it'll just kind of come floating up, and then the second you add G to the airplane, it'll just come falling straight down. So that's why you have to ensure with that big, a pen in the cockpit, not the biggest deal, but the cargo in the back and the people in the back, they have to be secured because it's this big cavernous metal container that if you were to float up to the top of it and then suddenly come to the bottom of it, the individual would get hurt. If you had loose cargo, it would affect the controllability and flight of the airplane. And you might ask, why do we do this? Come screaming out of the sky. Well, theoretically, without getting too deep into the tactics of it, if you had an airfield that was secure, but you were in hostile territory, you can come in high above the threat level, and then just at the last moment possible, theoretically under the umbrella of that safe airfield, you can come screaming down and land. So the time that you're in the enemy's air defenses or the adversary's air defenses is then therefore minimized, and will allow us to infiltrate and do those resupplying, sustainment operations, deployment operations, as called for. So we have 4 engines. Each produce about 40,000 pounds of thrust, so 20 tons if you put it straight up. So it's that's quite a lot of thrust right there. All that's to say, it's not as fuel efficient as say your Teslas or your Priuses of the day. I hate to imagine what my carbon footprint is after flying it for 15, 16 years, but about 20,000 pounds of fuel burned per flight. So that's significant. That's about 3,000 gallons, roughly, rough order of magnitude per hour flight. Our range, unlimited with aerial air refueling, which we get up behind a tanker. The Air Force now has 3 tankers: the KC-135 Shadow tanker, the KC-10 extender, and the KC-46 is the newest tanker that's being introduced in the Air Force inventory. It's the Pegasus. It's a redesigned Boeing 767. We get up behind them, and it's the most artful thing we do. We're right there, right behind the other airplanes. A little unsettling the first time you see it, because you typically don't have 2 massive airplanes right next to each other, flying through the sky at about roughly 250 knots, which at that altitude is about 400 miles an hour, and you're 10, 15 feet away from another airplane. You've got to maintain your position in the envelope, as we call it, and there's parameters in there, but you're making, as we call it, millions of corrections every single second as you kind of move in all the axes behind that airplane, and then we have aerodynamic effects on each other. But typical offload operation would be about 80,000 pounds of fuel from the tanker to the C-17 or 100,000. At typical transfer rates, you're in that position for about 15 minutes, 10 to 17 minutes. And you could have the airplane, and this is my own experience, you could have the airplane just cool down and chill down, and when you're done after those 15 to 17 minutes, you look like you just ran like a half marathon, because you're just it's a lot of concentration, a lot of effort. It gets better, it gets easier the more often you do it, like anything else, but it's definitely a perishable skill that we constantly practice on. And that's a lot of what you see us going out to practice on, because that is by far the most perishable skill we have. But it gives us the range that we need to do the things that we need to do. So getting to projecting America's strength, we have what we call joint forcible entry operations. If you remember, in 2003, there was negotiations between the U.S. government and Turkey to open up a northern front in Iraq over the land, and due to political reasons and diplomacy, we were unable to do that. So in order to open up that second front in northern Iraq, about 1,000 paratroopers, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, jumped into northern Iraq, and them and all their equipment. I believe it was 15 C-17s in formation with fighter escorts, and they secured the field at Bashur. Largest airborne assault since D-Day. So that's the formation flight and the airdrop that we practice for. Also a very perishable skill, because you need to ensure that you're in the proper position so all those guys end up in the same drop zone together, because you don't want people not to be where they're supposed to be in that kind of scenario, or landing someplace that's not flat, because you sometimes hear about it in the news. I don't know if anybody was ever in the Army or did any kind of airdrops. In off DZ, as we call it, drop zone airdrop, you could end up with people in trees and things like that, because they're coming down with gravity, and those chutes aren't necessarily as steerable as, say, a square chute that you kind of see that recreational jumpers or special forces use those kind of chutes as well.
Didn't something like that just happen just recently?
Did someone land off DZ? Is that?
In the trees and that, a night?
Yes, it did actually. As a
exercise?
matter of fact, I believe it was, I saw it in the news a couple of weeks ago. I believe it was in Mississippi. Is that correct?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That did happen. Yeah, and that's a big deal for us. We look at everything that went into that. It's a mishap. Someone, people can be seriously injured and or killed based on landing off drop zone. So that's something that the Air Force will look into following an off drop zone drop. Other than joint forcible entry operations, though, we conduct and the U.S. military participates in many exercises with our allies and partners globally, and it shows our resolve that we're partners with them and we work with their military. You can't go at it alone in any kind of war. You always want to have a coalition and have everybody fighting together towards the same goal, because we don't have unlimited capabilities and resources in the U.S. military and in the U.S. So we work with them, we learn from them, they learn from us. It's also a show of strength to those that would wish us ill globally. So examples of some exercises, and this is just a sampling. Exercise Talisman Saber, it's biannual. It's every 2 years. Is that biannual or is that every 6 months? I always get that confused. Semi-annual is every 6 months. So it's biannual exercise between the U.S. military and the Australian military. And in the 2015 iteration of Exercise Talisman Saber, a 5-ship of C-17s took off from Alaska with paratroopers, flew across the Pacific Ocean, and dropped them on a drop zone in Australia as part of that. That's a projection of power. It's a show of capability. There's no any other country that can do that type of operation, and it's good training for the air crews, the paratroopers, everyone involved. The tankers, the tanker aircraft that the airplanes had a rendezvous with to get the fuel that they needed to make that 16-hour journey. Exercise focused passage. Obviously, all of our exercises, you see them in the news with South Korea, have been suspended, and then they've started back at a smaller scale. Again, all based upon the politics and the ongoing negotiations with North Korea at the presidential level. But as part of our annual drill, which was called Exercise Full Eagle, that was the U.S. and South Korea's annual exercise, very high scale, high-end, high-tech equipment that we used to run. The airlift part of that, we would bring equipment into the fight, and then on our way home, we would exercise what we call non-combatant evacuation. So obviously, South Korea is a very populated country, specifically Seoul, which is a number of miles south of the military zone, vulnerable. So if there was a conflict there, part of what we would do, certainly get U.S. citizens out of South Korea, and then our coalition allies and partners, their citizens out as well, because you wouldn't want them in that situation. So that takes coordination of how you get them processed, what they can take on the airplane, what they can bring with them, be it a pet, simple things like that you don't even think of. And then where do you bring them? What country will accept them in to then get them back home? So all these things, we exercise in war game, kind of all these scenarios on a regular basis to ensure that if we needed to, we could execute and operate them. And then finally, with projecting strength, we regularly deploy, sustain, redeploy U.S. expeditionary forces wherever they are in the globe. Right now, in Europe, the European initiative to show our allies in NATO that we're there for them countering Russian aggression into Eastern Europe. We have a number of troops there. It's called Operation Atlantic Resolve. Rotational force, about 6,000 troops in 17 countries across Eastern Europe. We get them there, we get them out, we sustain them, we bring them the equipment that they need, and they're conducting regular military exercises with our allies and partners across Eastern Europe. And then well documented were our operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, where we were able to sustain the forces out there. Iraq was a little bit easier. It's closer to Kuwait, which is a port. Afghanistan, a landlocked country, really required some complex lines of logistics over land in Central Asia, and then also via air. And so a coordinated effort on that based on the urgency of what needed to get to the fight was coordinated either across land or through the air. So then we get into the good news story, America's goodwill, projecting that. And so during a foreign disaster, it's called Foreign Humanitarian Assistance, and the lead agency in the U.S. government on that is USAID, OFDA, Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, a subset of the State Department. State Department doesn't have its own logistics networks. USAID does not have its own logistics networks. That's where we come in and we support their efforts there. And so some notable events that have happened throughout my career where I have either been directly involved or indirectly involved include the tsunami in Indonesia in 2004, the Haiti earthquake in 2010, Operation Tomodachi in 2011, that was the tsunami in Japan and the subsequent disaster at their nuclear reactors there. Again, that's a scenario where we could have possibly had to evacuate American citizens, because you can imagine there's a great deal of American citizens living in Japan. And then the Ebola crisis in West Africa, a lot of logistics support for that. And this is a fact. Little known. Would you believe me if I told you that 2 Air Force C-130s landed in Iran to provide aid in 2003 following an earthquake there? So despite, there's a lot more rhetoric now than there was in 2003, but still, in 2003, that was the first U.S. Air Force airplane to go in there since they tried to rescue the hostages in 1980. So that's pretty interesting. A lot of people don't know that. And then domestically, we also support FEMA, who are in turn supporting the states and territories and the local authorities there, the local governments and governors, in a mission that we call Defense Support of Civil Authorities. We have a lot of capability in the military, in the DoD. We don't have any authority domestically. The National Guard has authority domestically. The reserves and active duty do not. The big law there where we don't have authority, posse comitatus. But when asked, we can support the big tickets, Katrina, New Orleans, Sandy in New York and New Jersey, and Maria in Puerto Rico in 17. And there's a picture there that's, I can tell you the exact number of people. I know just a wag, it's a lot of people, but it's 683 passengers. Floor loaded there in the back of the C-17, and that was out of the Philippines. Wow. So if we have to get you out of there, we'll, you're not going to get a seat, but we'll get you out of there. So how does the Air Force Reserve fit into all this? Well, since we're, like I mentioned earlier, I'm a part-timer. We have a core of full-time airmen, but we across AFRC, Air Force Reserve Command, we provide 17% of the Air Force's fighting force, but we only require 4% of the budget. Because when I'm not here in uniform, I'm not being paid by the Air Force. My health care is provided for by my civilian employer. Factors such as that, which personnel costs almost in any industry, are some of your larger and higher end costs. Our retirements aren't immediate, they're deferred until we're 65. You kind of run all those numbers out, and that's kind of how you end up with that. We share a lot of the active duty facilities. Great example, Wright-Patt. Active duty maintains the base and the runways. We have, you know, our section of the base with our buildings, but we get to use all their infrastructure, and that's all on their budget, you know. We're very much have a primary role in our strategic airlift, what we call mobility air forces, or the MAF, as opposed to the combat air forces, or the CAF. And so 46% of strategic airlift on any given day is provided by the Air Force Reserve and the Air National Guard. The other 54% is exclusively the active duty. So that's a pretty large chunk of what goes on for, as they call, you know, 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. It's kind of a misnomer. So regularly, AFRC uses these kinds of this data to, you know, support and advocate for our role in the DoD and in the Air Force, both in times of war and peace. And now I get to brag a little bit about the guys and gals in the squadron, the 89th, the Rhinos. You can see some of our civilian professions there. Despite our full-time corps, law enforcement, firefighters, and then we have a lot of airline pilots on the pilot side. We also have school teachers and that are pilots, engineers, etc. And now a couple of our members, Major Andrew Pierce, he lives in Columbus. He was just inducted into the Ohio State University Athletic Hall of Fame this past September. His primary, when he was running at Ohio State track and field, his primary event was the 400 meter. Of course, he did a whole bunch of relays. He won the Big Ten twice, first place, and he finished second in the NCAA for the 400 meters. About a 10 or 12 time All-American, because when you add up all his events and the multiple years of being an All-American at Ohio State. So he was just inducted in September. They put him on the field again in the Cincinnati, Ohio State game. Pretty awesome. Inducted with other notables were A.J. Hawk, Thad Mata. And I'll ask you all a question. 400 meters, so that's one loop around a standard kind of quarter-mile track. How fast do you think he ran that for his personal record? Because this amazes me. Sub 45 seconds, 44 and some change. So that's just smoking. I mean, so Andrew, he's a C-17 evaluated pilot, so that's the pinnacle pilot position. So he's excelled in our unit, both as an officer and a pilot. And he is a civilian profession. He's a Delta Airlines pilot, so you may see him flying you. If you do see him, you probably won't be able to catch him if you started running. But nonetheless, Andrew Pierce. So we're very proud to have him and everyone else. Mark Cannon, another one of our pilots, also a Delta pilot, but again, evaluator, pinnacle.
You talking to me?
Oh.
You talking to me?
No. And when Mark was on active duty, he got called on an alert and had to pick up the SEALs in Norfolk and take them off the Somali coast, where they were involved in a counter-piracy. This is actually following the Captain Phillips, which became famous in the movies. But to stop that action, and so he dropped the SEALs. A funny story he had on that is one of the obviously there's a lot of dialects there, you know, that aren't taught in our high schools per se, or schools. So they had to bring interpreters with them, so if they, you know, were able to intercept the radio transmissions, they knew what the pirates were saying. Well, suffice it to say that the interpreter wasn't a military member, nor a Navy SEAL, and trained to jump into a hostile zone and take care of business against these very dangerous pirates. So the interpreter, he said, the whole way from Norfolk, you know, to the coast of Africa. Was kind of, you know, a little bit unease, I think is a safe characterization of that. And then he had to get buckled up to one of the SEALs and then ran out the back ramp. You know, the two of them ran out the back ramp with, you know, one chute from the Navy SEAL and this interpreter. So that's a, Mark does a much better job telling the story than I do because he was there. He's a lot funnier than I am, but still, nonetheless, pretty cool story. And then Kim Naring, she's Master Sergeant, she's one of our load masters. She's a bar certified attorney in Ohio. So we have some awesome people out there doing our mission. So with that, I'll open it up to any kind of questions you all may have. Yes.
Reserve status. How do you separate or have time for the civilian work that you do, and then go into status at the airway?
Sure. So a very good question. The way I describe it to people, it's a three-legged stool. Your life when you commit to be a reservist, you have your civilian employer in that profession. You have your military career in the reserves, and you have your family. And if any kind of three-legged stool, if one leg's too big, too short, it's going to fall over and topple over itself. So that's a long answer to tell you. It's a juggling game and a balance. Many civilian employers are very easy to work with. I know I can speak for my company. If I need to take time off to do something, they're more than okay with that. Of course, I don't get paid during that time that I take away from them. And if I take too much time off, I won't get benefits from them. So then I'll have to take them from the military. But it's just a constant balance. And we are protected by federal law. USARA is the federal law that protects all Guard reserves.
Okay, so do you then, let's say, gosh, I'd like to go fly the C-17s in 6 weeks, then you just voluntarily leave your civilian slot to go to the military, or is it dictated by the needs, or how you rotate it?
All that depends on the relationship with the employer and probably what your career is. A little bit more difficult in some careers. I'm very fortunate as an airline pilot. Full-time is roughly 2 weeks a month. So I can, with 6 months out, I know what my Air Force requirements are and what days I need to be here at Wright-Patt and flying missions. I can bid the 2 weeks that I fly for my civilian employer around those days, knowing them. And so then I just do both jobs, if you will.
Yeah.
So.
What's the staffing level of Wright-Patt for your wing?
The wing itself is about 2,500 members. The squadron, which I'm more familiar with the squadron numbers, 124 in the 89th. And our full-time corps is 25 to 30 folks. And so the rest, the other 90 plus, roll in under them. They go to work. They wear a uniform every day, but they are getting paid similar to a federal employee on a government salary scale, even though they're wearing a uniform. So to anybody who might come across them, you just assume that they're Major X or Lieutenant Colonel Y or Staff Sergeant Davis. But they are the backbone and core of the Air Force Reserve. Without them, we couldn't just show up and plug and play. They keep all of our functional programs running. They're the ones who provide the majority of training for us, the part-timers that come in for a number of days each month.
Do you fly for Delta too?
I fly for UPS is who I fly for.
And is there a Rickenbacker yet? Are they still reserved?
So Rickenbacker is
Springfield?
Yeah. Well, Springfield is Guard, and Rickenbacker is Reserve.
Rickenbacker's Columbus, Southland.
Yeah. So they fly KC-135s there, and the Springfield Guard unit used to fly F-16s, and now they fly what we call RPAs, or remotely piloted aircraft, commonly known as drones, UAVs.
You're not too far from where they build that Abrams tank too.
Really? I didn't know that.
Lima.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Yeah. Well, It's one, that's another piece of machinery. I couldn't give you a brief on it. I just know it's big and it takes up about the whole back of the C-17.
Do you have simulators now at Wright-Patterson for your ground training? You have simulators, you have to go to a contractor somewhere?
Yeah, so we have a C-17 simulator on Wright-Patt. It's manned by contractors that used to work for Boeing, now and then L3, and now they're with Flight Safety. But all of the sim instructors are, retired Air Force, so they flew the airplane operation.
Are they over on the other side of the field?
Yeah, so they're if you know the layout of Wright-Patt, where the C-17s are bed down, the ramp, that's our side of that's the reserve side of the base. They're just on the other side of the runway with base ops in a building there. So. Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Glad to talk about it.